Hello again, and welcome to the penultimate episode of a Tolkien fan's impressions of Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. This, of course, is episode 7, The Eye. And, a lot happened in this episode. One of the most plot-heavy episodes of the series, actually. And it sets up a few things quite nicely for the finale. So I guess to start with the most obvious starting position is the story of the Númenóreans and Galadriel, which has, at least for this episode, come together. The reveal at the end of the last episode that Mordor has been created and that the defense of the Southlands was for nothing. I think this ties actually in quite well to a lot of the character development on display in this episode. One of the things that I actually like about Rings of Power as a series, and have liked about it, for the last couple of episodes, is that it actually does play into something that is really important in the Silmarillion, which is the theme of failure. The Silmarillion, and particularly the first age, but also the second age to a large extent, is full of people who fail, either in personal reasons or just across entire societies. The Noldor ultimately fail. The Númenóreans ultimately fail. And that is sort of, it's not necessarily inevitable, but it's as a result of large long-term impacts of things, like the Númenóreans' fear of death, or the Noldor, the kinslaying of that the Noldor do, and that's something that I think Rings of Power actually delves into. Is a lot of the series is sort of concerned with failure, and this episode particularly concerns itself with the failure both of the Númenóreans and Galadriel, and with the failure of Durin. But to move back towards the Númenóreans for a minute, the fallout from the last episode is done fairly well, I would say. Obviously we have a secondary character dying off, which is, whatever. But Muriel being blinded, I think, is quite a nice way of showing us the consequences of these actions as well. Obviously, that will be a real issue for her when she goes back to Númenor, particularly given the power-hungry Pharazôn and the fact that she wasn't able to complete her mission, with it all ending in complete disaster. It suggests to me that they're going to play around with Pharazôn's attempt to unseat her next season. And I guess we'll see how that plays out going forward. Isildur... One of the problems with having a series like this is that everyone already knows that Isildur is not dead, because, well, let's be honest here, he can't die because he has to be around to cut the ring from Sauron's hand. So having Isildur, left behind in Middle-earth isn't, I think, a bad thing, but it does... there's no tension to it. We all know that he's going to survive. I do think it's interesting that they're setting him up to have his own series of adventures in Middle-earth, away from Númenor. And, well, I think that, depending on how it's done, could go really well. It could be nice to see more of a sort of ranger's eye view of Middle-earth, as it were. Certainly, I think that from a kind of visual and a world-building perspective, my favourite parts of the series thus far have been the Harfoots and kind of the more natural landscapes, although I do very much like a lot of the more kind of regal and high fantasy stuff as well. So I would be all in favour of having a series where Isildur kind of traverses across Middle-earth, seeing areas of Middle-earth that we haven't seen visualised before in TV or film. But that's, I presume, for the next season. The relationship between Galadriel and Theo, I actually thought was well done and felt quite natural. She acted the way I think any adult would act, finding a abandoned child during a war zone, and I think her conversation with him about kind of taking responsibility for certain things, picking up and putting down guilt. Obviously, it harks back to a few references within Lord of the Rings. Of course, the sort of Gandalf's discussion with Frodo about other powers at work beyond the hands of evil obviously was a big influence here. I also think that the idea of kind of finishing it, whose job it is to finish it, ties in with kind of Elrond's line, at least in the books, that if Bilbo had started it, he might be expected to finish it, when Bilbo offers to sort of go and take the ring to Mount Doom. Overall, I liked that section, and of course humanizing Galadriel a bit more, revealing that Celeborn was alive at some point and is apparently now dead is interesting. As Tolkien lore fans will know, elves in Tolkien's universe don't die. If they are killed in battle, they just go to the halls of the Valar. So I'm assuming this is a universe that doesn't work by those rules, where elves can just physically die. That was sort of implied in the Jackson films as well, with Aragorn's reaction to the death of the elves at Helm's Deep. I'm kind of okay with that, to be honest. I think they've got enough to be dealing with right now without trying to bring in a lot more complicated mythological stuff. Although, as I'll get to, I do find it interesting that they bring in specifically Aule and his work in creating the dwarves in this episode when discussing Durin and Durin. So they clearly do want to take a more sort of overtly mythological, overtly mythical approach to the universe of Tolkien than the Jackson films did, which mostly left all of that stuff out with the Valar and the Eru. So maybe they will explain this away. I mean, obviously, Galadriel has to get back together with Celeborn at some point, so maybe he'll be revealed not to be dead, or maybe they'll just bring him back to life because he's an elf. I'm not sure. I guess we'll see. Galadriel and Theo's discussion of consequentialist versus intentionalist moral philosophy was also interesting. And I think the idea of intentions being important is something that I think comes through a lot in Tolkien's work. So I think he would have approved of Galadriel taking the approach that she took. Aside from that, I guess the other major emotional hook of the Númenórean storyline was, of course, Elendil. We talked about Isildur going missing, but Elendil, I have to say, the actor's performance as kind of Elendil as a stricken father was very good. The delivery of that line, "Where is my son?" was very effective, and I think overall he's actually been one of the best actors that the show has. I also buy his grief and his turning on Galadriel. We'll have to see whether it's long term or not, given that he took her in, and ultimately everything she's done has led to the destruction of Númenor's army, or at least one part of it, the humiliation and the blinding of the Queen, and now apparently the death of his own son. I will say I did think that the sort of horse rider relationship angle did seem a bit silly. I didn't hate it or anything, but it feels out of place in a series which, again, despite delving more into the mythological side of things than the Peter Jackson films did, still hasn't really gone deep into the sort of weirdness and the mythology of Tolkien. So to have this sort of one-off kind of relationship thing between the horse and the rider feels just a bit odd to me. I feel like they should have either done more of that sort of stuff or less of it, rather than just having bits and pieces here and there. Although it's also clear that they're doing that to give Isildur a horse when he wakes up. So the Harfoots, I guess I'll talk about next, because their story this episode was fairly small but important. So the kind of jumping back and forth about the stranger, is he good, is he bad? I think this episode conclusively proves that he is good. Within Tolkien's work, there's always a focus on the idea of goodness being something that shines through in a person. And I don't think that the stranger would be able to do something like heal and restore an apple tree if he was, in fact, a creation of evil. That doesn't strike me as something that an evil character in a universe made by Tolkien would be able to do. And although this is an adaptation, I don't think it will stray that far from the original vision, at least in kind of thematic terms. So the Harfoots themselves, of course, casting out the stranger, I do think it is a bit silly, and I do think that some of the conflicts in the Harfoot episodes do feel a bit contrived. The Harfoot storyline, sorry. Certainly, I think there's not just the Harfoots. There are definitely a few contrived conflicts throughout the series, but the Harfoots, I think, have the worst of it. Because it's just silly to get annoyed with the guy for trying to help you when ultimately it wasn't his fault that a child decided to run out and got a branch dropped on her. I do buy that these are a very insular people who are, quick to run away and shun those who are kind of seen as even as slightly a threat to them. But given that the stranger had just rescued at least 3 Harfoots from direwolves, I feel like it feels a little. It feels a little much for them to just immediately turn on him, particularly given that they couldn't even let him last the night. Of course, it might be that the stranger himself is the one who decides to give up on the Harfoots because he doesn't want to hurt them. And that, I think, would be a much more interesting dynamic, and I'm kind of annoyed they didn't explicitly say that, because the way it's shot, it appears that it's the Harfoots who are telling the strangers to leave. But if the stranger was the one who wanted to leave, I actually think that would work a lot better for the character, given the relationship they've built up with Nori and the Harfoots more generally. And of course, the tying in of the creepy cult dark spirits. I'm not sure what they would be actually in Tolkien's pantheon. It's pretty clear that they're after the stranger for whatever reason. I guess we'll find out. And Nori's actions actually make sense from her perspective. I am surprised though, given how angry Sadok and the rest of the Harfoots were with with Nori keeping the stranger a secret, and how it almost made them be left behind almost effectively to die, that the fact that Nori's actions gets the entire camp set on fire to the point where, the Harfoots themselves may just not be able to live. There's no recriminations or anything. It's not as if the evil spirits found Nori, she went up to them and engaged them, and it was her and her family who ultimately kind of caused the confrontation. Again, it makes sense from Nori's perspective because she wants to help the stranger and keep him safe. But from the other Harfoot's perspective, given everything that we've seen of them, I would have expected them to be much harsher towards Nori. But it could be that they were more sympathetic because they also realised they had done wrong by the stranger. But yeah, so that's the Harfoot storyline, and presumably we will get some kind of resolution with the stranger in the next episode. Finally, I do want to talk about the Dwarven storyline. Now, I would say that thus far, the Dwarf storyline, particularly the Elven Dwarven storyline with Elrond and Durin, has been my favourite storyline from a sort of emotional sense. I think the bonds of sort of brotherhood and fellowship between Durin and Elrond are done very nicely, and I like that we can see kind of an old friendship that had been somewhat left by the wayside kind of rebuilt through both Elrond and Durin's actions. I also really like that we see the influence of Durin's family, his wife and children as well, on his relationship with Elrond. And ultimately, I think that this episode really crowns that importance, because it also introduces us to the other aspect of the major Dwarven storyline, the relationship between Durin and his father, which of course ends extremely poorly in this episode. The conflict between the two of them is the sort of classic conflict of the old, conservative, staid, established figure and the younger, more, not necessarily radical, but more open to change and more dynamic figure. And as is often the case with these sort of storylines, the established figure has the power and the younger figure wishes to acquire the power. Both dwarves have a good point here. Obviously, we as the audience, as is revealed at the end, as well, know that there is a Balrog in the mines. But putting that to one side, both sides have a good point here. Obviously, Durin is concerned with the safety of his own people, fundamentally, and he has a very long-term view of the way things should be, to the point where he's willing just to let the elves fade away because that's how things should go, according to him. Whereas Durin the Younger, I guess, is much more emotionally attached to the elves because of Elrond, but also it's clear that there is a lot of resentment he feels towards his father and the way his father has treated him, which does also come through in, Durin Senior's actions towards him. He doesn't deny that he's been suffocating or that he's been somewhat almost intentionally trying to restrict Prince Durin's actions. He doesn't deny that. He just says that, that was a form of tempering, which, honestly, I'm not surprised that Prince Durin has issues with the way his father treats him. Of course, he is, at least at that point, still the heir to the throne. So, King Durin certainly has different ideas. I find it interesting also that King Durin takes such issue with the idea of Prince Durin, thinking that Elrond is like a brother to him. It shows, again, King Durin's attachment to family and his view of kith and kin. And the story he tells of how he, healed Prince Durin's respiratory issue is also very touching. I think, that scene by itself does a good job of humanizing both the characters, making them both flawed individuals who you can understand the perspective of, but ultimately neither of them really come across particularly well, I would say, given what we've seen of them thus far. Although Prince Durin, obviously we've seen more of him, so he's more understandable. I also think it's interesting that in the aftermath of this, not only does Prince Durin, of course, sort of be stripped of his heirship, or at least that's what's implied, which will, I'm sure, lead to all sorts of fermenting issues between the king and his once heir. But also that Durin's wife almost takes on more of a sort of Lady Macbeth sort of tone, in that she's actively now kind of egging him on to, if not usurp, then at least bypass the authority of the king. I think this suggests that they're setting up a real internal political tension within Khazad-dûm, which I'm sure will be played out more in the seasons to come. I'm presuming this may be part of the reason why in this version of the story, the dwarves do not aid the elves when Sauron sacks Hollin or Erygion. So I think there's a lot there to be done with. We also, of course, know that Durin must take over from Durin Senior because the line of Durin has to continue. So I'll be interested to see how they square that circle. And of course, the reveal of the Balrog at the end is not a reveal to anybody who knows the backstory of the fall of Khazad-dûm, but certainly I will be interested to see how this will go. My guess will be that there'll be a story based around a power struggle between Prince Durin and King Durin. Prince Durin will win, he will open the mines, and that's when the Balrog will appear. Of course, they also set up that many of the Dwarven lords themselves are interested in extracting the mithril, and the king is the only one who really objects. So again, setting up power bases for a future political conflict within Khazad-dûm. With regards to Elrond, again, talking about failure, the fact that Elrond ultimately fails is also important. And I think that his relationship with Durin is the most abiding. And I will be interested to see how it changes if and when Durin ends up becoming king. And of course, what happens with the Balrog. But one thing I wanted to discuss before we end is how, in this sense, I actually think that The Rings of Power does a better job than the Jackson films at getting at one of the kind of core themes of Tolkien's universe, which is the importance of working with others, working with those who are different to you to achieve long-term goals. So much of the tragedy and strife in the First Age comes as a result of the Noldor effectively trying to force their own ways onto their brother elves and ultimately ending in the kinslaying. Also, of course, the issue of elven and dwarven relations is soured by all sorts of things, but particularly by the Silmarils. And so, the conflict between the elves and dwarves bursts out into warfare as a result of the Silmarils and as a result of the dwarves and the elves both lusting after them. So I think that one thing that, Rings of Power does better than the Jackson films is to show the importance of cross-species, cross-racial in the Rings of Power context, friendships, And yes, the Jackson films do that with Gimli and Legolas, but frankly, that's often played for laughs. And with, aside from the one really potent line, I never thought I'd die standing side by side with an elf. What about side by side with a friend? Which is genuinely really affecting, and it's become a meme for a reason. But aside from that, a lot of the relationship between Legolas and Gimli is sort of played for laughs in the trilogy, and I think the broader message doesn't necessarily come across the way it does in the books. Whereas I think Rings of Power does a good job actually of showing the importance of the relationship between Durin and Elrond, and when Durin goes to see Gil-galad in Lindon, and the difficult diplomatic relationship between the elves and the dwarves. It shows the need for that kind of cross-racial knowledge and understanding. And we see this also to perhaps a lesser extent in the Southlands, where the tension between elves and men reaches the point where some of the men are willing to side directly with the orcs against those they perceive as their sort of elven overlords. So again, I think that's something that Rings of Power actually does better than the Jackson films, and I'll be interested to see if this comes back, particularly because, again, the Second Age is certainly an age that is ultimately ended by the rise of Númenorian imperialism, the decision by the Númenorians to oppress the native peoples, the native men of Middle-earth, and that is a large part of what ultimately leads down to their eventual fall. So I'll be interested to see where Rings of Power takes this particularly important aspect of Tolkien's work going forward. Oh yes, and finally, I thought it was interesting that Gil-galad's name was actually used in this episode. In previous episodes, I've wondered as to maybe they just simply called him the High King because they weren't able to use Gil-galad's name for rights reasons, but no, they refer to him as Gil-galad here, which is strange to me. I don't know why they wouldn't have used it before. There would have been plenty of opportunity for them to do so. And given that Elrond is on at least decent terms with Gil-galad, you'd think that he would have used his name before this point. But, oh well, never mind. I guess the writers had a different opinion. Anyway, here ends the recap of episode 7. Please do let me know what you thought of it as well. And I guess we'll have to wait and see for the finale next week. Thank you and goodbye.